Midlife Crisis, Second Chances Book 1. Written by Jason Ayres. Narrated by Adrian James. Chapter 1. No Future. November 2018. Richard Kent was having a bad day. This was not unusual. He had a lot of bad days. This was an exceptionally dismal one, even by his standards. At 42 years old, he had just been dismissed from the only job he had ever known. After 2 decades in the police force, he had been unceremoniously booted out on his ear. They had dressed it up and called it voluntary redundancy, but he knew the sack when he saw it. He had been given an offer he couldn't refuse: jump or be pushed. So he had jumped, and now here he was, contemplating another jump. It was 4:30 on a freezing cold November afternoon, and he was standing on top of the multi-storey car park that dominated the skyline of his hometown. The building was relatively new, part of an unprecedented amount of local building going on in what was rapidly becoming just another bland London commuter town. The sky was a huge red and gold expanse to the west where the sun had just set, a brilliant display of colour that complemented the many leaves blowing around in the autumn breeze. As far as Kent was concerned, it may as well have been setting on his life. He hadn't just had a bad day, he'd had a bad decade. In fact, thinking back over his life in general, he would have to conclude that it had been downhill since the millennium. There just did not seem to be any point in carrying on. Not only were the best days of his life seemingly behind him, but he also hated just about everything about the modern world. From the way it was treating him, apparently it hated him back. As for the future, that was a huge, increasingly alien landscape from which he would only become further and further disconnected. Had there been anyone up on the roof with him, he could have ranted and raved for an hour about his woes, but even if there had been anyone there, would they have listened? He had vented his frustrations enough times in the pub, and no one there took any notice. The core group of regulars in the Red Lion were in just as miserable a state as he was. Most of the others who came into the pub were just people half his age, and he had nothing in common with them. They were too busy being young, carefree, and enjoying themselves. They were not remotely interested in anything he had to say. It seemed like only yesterday that Kent had been just like them, having fun and ignoring the has-beens at the bar. He had never even contemplated the fact that one day he would become one of them. If anyone had asked him there and then what was wrong with his life, he would have responded with, "Where do I start?" The list was endless. The security of his job had been ripped away from him. His teenage kids either ignored him or took the piss out of him, and his wife, Debs, nagged him continually. As for any sort of sex life, well, that had dwindled to the point where he could describe all the action he'd had in the past year on the back of a postage stamp. He hated modern music, television, and popular culture in general. The town he had grown up in was unrecognisable. Nearly all the great old pubs had closed down or been modernised to such an extent that Kent considered them ruined, and all the decent shops had gone. All of that would not have been so bad if he still had his health, but that was going to pieces as well. His once flowing locks of dark hair were rapidly thinning on top. He had ballooned in weight to 18 stone, and his eyesight was rapidly declining. On top of all that, he had suffered from attacks of gout and piles, and for the past 5 years had been taking a cocktail of pills every day to control his blood pressure. In short, not only was his mind a mess, his body was as well. There was no point in moaning about it to Debs or anyone else. They never had any sympathy. She blamed all of his ills on the pub. All that was, apart from the eyesight. This, she had cruelly suggested, was down to his own self-abuse after discovering a stack of hardcore pornographic DVDs that he'd been hiding for years in the garden shed. His lame excuse that they'd been confiscated in a police raid after being illegally smuggled into the country had not been believed. Considering how unforthcoming she had been in the bedroom in recent years, Kent felt that she'd been unduly harsh, but then she was about most things. Other men in Kent's situation had affairs, but this was not a road he had any intention of traversing. He'd seen the mess it had got other people into, and he could do without the aggravation. Besides, he was painfully aware that he couldn't have an affair even if he wanted to. The sad truth was that women didn't fancy him anymore. In his youth, attractive, willing girls seemed to be everywhere. At the police Christmas parties back in the 1990s, there were always plenty of WPCs who were keen for a snog and a grope in the stationery cupboard. That sort of thing doubtless still went on, but the girls doing it were 20 years younger than him now, and there was a whole new breed of alpha males for them to play with. Kent had spent most of last year's Christmas party standing at the bar, doing more or less the same thing he did all year in his local pub, moaning. The only woman who had made Kent any sort of offer in recent times was Kay, a drunken middle-aged trollop in his local pub. He'd known her since school days, when she had been the brightest and prettiest girl in the class, but she had squandered her early promise on alcohol. These days she was well known as the pub's local bike, and Kent had steered a wide berth. No matter how bad things got, he swore he would never get that desperate. Besides, he'd always maintained a strict policy of never sleeping with anyone with fewer teeth than he had. Was that all he had to look forward to? A wife who'd gone cold on him, a stack of porn in the shed, and offers from toothless old crones? As he stood on the roof with all these thoughts tumbling through his mind, all he could think about was how much better life had been in the past. As for the future, he certainly couldn't imagine any scenario where things were going to improve. In fact, he could only envisage things getting worse. Was it really worth sticking around to find out? Why not just end it all, here and now? Chapter 2. Modern Life is Rubbish. November 2018. When he was young, it had all been so different. Kent had really felt part of the world, embracing popular culture along with the rest of his generation. He'd felt edgy, cool, and at the forefront of everything that was happening. He'd been born in 1976 at the end of one of the longest and hottest summers the UK had ever known. He knew this because he'd been told about it by his mother. She complained many times about how uncomfortable it had been, being heavily pregnant in the heat, sounding as if she blamed him. Kent felt this was a little harsh. He could hardly help when he was born. If anyone was to blame for the timing of the event, it was his father. He had popped out on the bank holiday Monday at the end of August, just as the heat wave broke and the heavens opened. He couldn't remember anything about the 1970s, but he did know that he'd been born into a great time. It was the beginning of the glorious era of punk rock, just before the Sex Pistols were about to shock the establishment. He'd loved pop music when he was a kid. One of his earliest memories was seeing David Bowie performing Ashes to Ashes on Top of the Pops. Very soon after that, he became obsessed with the charts. It started with listening to the weekly rundown on Sunday tea times with his sister. A few years later, he insisted that he be allowed to come home from his lunches on Tuesdays in order to hear the brand new chart being revealed. As the DJ read out the songs, he used to try and write them down as quickly as possible in a Woolworths exercise book. Then he'd gain kudos from his classmates when he took the book back into school in the afternoon to announce the rundown all over again for them. He was only about 9 or 10 when he was doing this, and had bold aspirations at the time to become a Radio 1 DJ when he grew up. By the time he was in his mid-teens, he was helping out a DJ who ran mobile discos at various local youth clubs and social clubs, but that amounted mostly to fetching and carrying for a bit of extra pocket money. Rarely was he let loose on the decks, and this was as far as his DJing career ever went. Various other distractions such as girls and beer got in the way, so, like most of his youthful ambitions, it ultimately came to nothing. As he became increasingly aware of the whole music scene in the early 1980s, he seemed thrilled at how vibrant and exciting it seemed. The highlight of the week was Thursday evening when Top of the Pops came on. Week after week, new and innovative acts filled the screen alongside the more established artists. He could remember so many watershed moments, such as the first time Culture Club appeared. "Is it a boy or a girl?" was the hot topic of conversation at school the next day. Even at 5 or 6 years old, all of the kids were into music in a big way. It wasn't long until he went through a major rite of passage of every child in those halcyon days, the buying of his first single. It was 1984, and he didn't get a huge amount of pocket money at the time, 50p a week if he remembered rightly. Although 50p went a lot further in 1984 than it did in 2018, he still had to save up for 2 weeks to be able to afford to buy a record. It was very hard for him to resist spending the first week's money on sweets, which was where his pocket money usually went, but he had put the money in his piggy bank and vowed not to touch it. Nearly all music back then came on 7-inch vinyl singles. CD was in its infancy, and cassette singles had not really caught on. They never did, as far as he could remember. His sister, who was 3 years older, already had a large collection of singles from the big stars of the day. It was she who had taken him down to Woolworths to buy that first single. How he remembered and cherished that moment. Life had seemed so simple back then, and the world an exciting and amazing place full of new experiences. That world that he had grown up in was long gone. Even Woolworths, a shop that had been ever present throughout his life and a monument to his childhood, had vanished, gone bankrupt during a recession which Kent blamed on reckless and greedy bankers. The reality was, it probably would have gone bust anyway sooner or later, a victim of changing times, rather like Kent himself. As he had grown up, the music scene had got ever more exciting. By the time the seemingly futuristic year of 1990 rolled around, Kent was a teenager and ready to fully embrace the whole Manchester music scene. The Stone Roses, the Happy Mondays, the Charlatans, and many more provided the soundtrack to the first half of his teenage life. As soon as he turned 13, he'd got himself a paper round. For this, he got the princely sum of £15 a week, most of which he spent on records. After much badgering, his parents had bought him a small hi-fi system for his 15th birthday, which contained that most modern of things at the time, a CD player. He would spend many a happy hour up in his room, as well as a few melancholy ones, playing his CDs over and over again. Whatever his mood, he had the perfect album to accompany it. Other kids were into computer games or football, but Kent just loved his music. That music just seemed to get better and better. By the time he'd reached his late teens and started drinking in pubs, Britpop had arrived. In 1994, he'd lost his virginity in his bedroom to a girl called Mandy, who worked in The Little Chef. This landmark moment in his life was played out to the backdrop of Blur's Park Life, still his favourite album of all time. Life was exciting and full of promise. He nurtured dreams of becoming a rock star himself. To that end, he decided to teach himself the guitar, and then form a band. Unfortunately, his attempts to play the guitar were appalling. It wasn't for want of trying, but he had no natural ability in that area whatsoever. Just as with the DJing, his interest in it fizzled out. He spent a year bumming around after leaving school, trying to decide what to do, before settling for the considerably more mundane life of a career in the police force instead. And then, frustratingly, the music changed. He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when he fell out of love with the music scene, but he guessed it must have been around the time of his 30th birthday. He'd been growing increasingly disillusioned with the proliferation of manufactured plastic pop in the charts in the early 2000s. Of course, boy bands and girl bands had always been there, but he hadn't minded them so much in his younger years. Perhaps it was because a lot of them back then still had genuine talent, as well as writing a lot of their own material. But after the millennium, there was a distinct change in the musical landscape. Kent blamed TV talent shows, which had become very big around that time. It was suddenly all about a procession of wannabe stars being paraded on TV singing songs that the audience already knew. Performance was everything. Creative talent and songwriting skills were irrelevant. Songs that the public didn't know weren't good for viewing figures. Rehashing tried and tested former hits was. He absolutely hated this kind of approach, and the more popular it became, the more he railed against it. What could he do? Everyone else seemed to love it. It took up a huge amount of space in the tabloids, and it was all his younger colleagues at work ever seemed to talk about. He couldn't even escape it at home. His wife was glued to it every Saturday and Sunday night. As if that wasn't bad enough, she also felt the need to waste money phoning in votes for the talentless morons who performed on the shows. In Kent's opinion, It was blatantly all fixed, so what was the point in voting anyway? His opinion was vindicated on this a few years later, when a voting scandal erupted. At least there had still been some decent music around at the time to keep him sane. He loved the Killers, the Kaiser Chiefs, Keane and Maroon 5. But over time, even these bands seemed to fade from the scene, squeezed out by an increasing number of artists filling up the charts that Kent had never heard of. By the time the decade drew to a close, the charts were full of unfamiliar names to him. Nearly every song in the chart seemed to be by some over-egotistical DJ or rapper with a silly name featuring someone else with an even stupider name. Quite apart from the ridiculous monikers these new acts went by, couldn't they even stick to their own stuff anymore? What was with all the collaborations? He couldn't make sense of it all. Top of the Pops went off air around this time, another piece of his childhood stripped away, though in truth he had long since stopped watching it. As for Radio 1, that had become just as relevant to him as a weather forecast for Jupiter. He was grimly aware that he was no longer part of the target demographic, and that the station he had grown up with no longer wanted him. It wasn't just the music they played that he couldn't relate to, but the DJs too. They spoke a language he no longer understood. On the few occasions he got a chance to listen to the wireless now, he found himself increasingly drawn to Radio 2, despite the fact that he'd mocked the station not that many years earlier. He remembered one night when he was out on a colleague's stag night, and some of the lads had tried to leave early because they were on duty in the morning. At the time he had ripped the piss out of them, quipping, "You lightweights, you'll be listening to Radio 2 next." It didn't seem so funny now. Those chickens had well and truly come home to roost. Most of the DJs he'd grown up listening to on Radio 1 had been moved across to the sister station, and grudgingly he was being forced to join them too. He'd also been gutted when John Peel had died. In his opinion, the best DJ of all time. Unlike many who claim to have spent their formative years listening to Peel in an attempt to look cool, Kent genuinely had. As the years flew by, more and more of those who had such an influence on his early life through music and TV passed on. With each death, Kent felt a tiny piece of himself dying inside too. This process seemed to be accelerating by early 2016, when hardly a week went by without some childhood hero or other dying, leading him to question his own mortality. There was no danger of his friends finding out about his shameful defection to Radio 2, as he no longer had any proper mates. His social life had disappeared into the abyss around the same time he fell out of love with music. He still spent a lot of time in the pub, but they weren't the type of nights out that he had enjoyed when he was younger. Then, him and a bunch of other lads had started at the top of the town and worked their way around the town's pubs every Friday night. Now those lads had gone their separate ways, and he was reduced to standing at the bar with the other middle-aged losers, going on about how much better life had been in the good old days. As the 2010s wore on, things just got worse and worse musically. He thought he was moving with the times, now listening to his old music on an iPod Classic rather than playing CDs. But before long it seemed even that was considered old hat. When he had gone into an electrical superstore in search of a new hi-fi system, he'd asked one of the young lads who worked there if they had one with an iPod dock. The assistant, he couldn't have been older than about 19, had looked at him as if he had been asking for something to play wax cylinders on. He then proceeded to completely flummox Kent with talk of Bluetooth, Wi-Fi speakers, and various other bits of technobabble that went completely over his head. As he left the shop, he heard the assistant say to a colleague behind him, "iPod dock," and they both burst out laughing. As he stood on the car park roof, thinking about all these things, he reflected that even without all the problems in his life, the state of the music industry alone was enough to make him want to commit suicide. Maybe he should. Why not just end it all, leap off the roof, and get out of this horrible modern world in which he no longer belonged? The 20th century was never coming back. He was never going to feel that exuberant burst of youth and excitement about anything ever again. So what was the point in carrying on? "If only you could go back, eh?" said a voice behind him. Kent turned to see a slim young man in a plain black t-shirt, blue jeans and white trainers standing behind him. The man looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't quite place him. "Excuse me?" asked Kent. "If only you could go back," repeated the man eagerly. and live it all over again. It wouldn't be so bad, would it?" "Do what all over again?" asked Kent, perplexed. Who was this guy? What did he want? "What you were just thinking about," said the mysterious stranger. "The good old days when music was great and you didn't have a care in the world." "How do you know what I was thinking about?" asked Kent. The November wind was bitingly cold, and he drew his coat up around his neck to keep in the warmth. He looked at the young man in just a T-shirt and added, "Aren't you cold?" "No, I'm not. But then I wouldn't be. I'm not really here at all, you see. It's quite warm where I am." "Great," said Kent. "On top of everything else, now I'm talking to a nutter. That's it. I'm out of here." He placed his hands on the metal fencing that surrounded the car park and thought about the best way of climbing up. That was if he even could. He was so fat and unfit, even getting up a 6-foot fence was going to prove problematical. He'd have clambered over something like that for fun, chasing villains back in his Met days. "Oh, I'm not a nutter," said the man. "And you're not hallucinating either," preempting what would have been Kent's next thought. "I'm here, but I'm not here, if that makes any sense. I just saw you there, thinking about killing yourself, and popped along to see if I could do anything to help." "What are you, some sort of guardian angel?" asked Kent, in the gruff style he'd often used in the force when interviewing suspects. He was rather intrigued by this strange encounter. If nothing else, it was the first time anyone had made the effort to speak to him in public for months. "If you like to think of me in that way, then go ahead," he replied. "I've had many names in my time, but I'm happy to be your angel." And then, again, reading Kent's thoughts. "And I don't mean in a gay way. You're such a homophobe thinking that. Still, I wouldn't blame you for fancying me. Haven't you recognised me yet? Look closely." Kent peered into the fresh-faced young man, and a strange realisation dawned. He was looking at a much younger version of himself. "What? How is this possible? Are you me? How did you get here?" A multitude of questions raced through his mind. If it was indeed him in a younger form, wouldn't he have remembered meeting his older self when he was him? "Relax. I'm not you. I just made myself look like this to see if you remembered the person you used to be. It could just have easily looked like this." As the angel spoke, he morphed into the long shape of a beautiful young woman with long blonde hair who Kent recognised immediately. It was his wife Debbie, but not as she looked now. This was how she looked when he first met her 20 years ago, before age, 2 kids, and too many cakes took their toll. "No, don't," said Kent, thinking about what used to be. "It's too depressing." The angel morphed back into the form of the young Kent. "You can't fight the passage of time, Richard. Beauty is ephemeral, and the world is constantly evolving. You need to adapt and embrace life in all shapes and forms as you make your way through it." "I know all that," said Kent, "but it's so damned hard. I miss the old days. I wish I'd appreciated them more when I was there. At the time, I never even considered that one day they might end." "You're right. It would be better if I could go back and live it over again. It was so much better then than it is now." "As a great man once said, youth is wasted on the young," said the angel. "But do you really think it was as great in the past as you remember? Or do you think you're just looking back through rose-tinted spectacles?" "Well, there's no way of finding that out, is there?" remarked Kent ruefully. "What if I said there was?" replied the angel. "What if I told you I had the power to let you go back and live any day of your life over again? Where would you go, or indeed, when would you go? Which day would you choose?" "You really do that?" asked Kent excitedly. Having already seen this angel shapeshift, he obviously had some sort of supernatural abilities. "Can you take me back and let me do it all over again?" "Not all of it, no," replied the angel. "That would be a bit greedy of you. You do only get one life after all, but I can give you the chance to relive a few snapshots, a sort of edited highlights if you like." "So how's that going to work?" asked Kent. "Well, think of me like one of those pantomime genies giving you 3 wishes. In fact, since I'm more generous than that, I'm going to give you double. What would you say If I offer to let you live 6 days of your life over again, it can be any 6 of your choice. When and where would you like to go? Kent thought back quickly through his life. Where indeed? It wasn't an easy decision to make, just like that on the spur of the moment. He needed time to think about it. And how would this mysterious angel know exactly where to send him? He couldn't remember precise dates and times when things had taken place. "Don't worry about any of that," said the angel. Clearly, it had the ability to reach into his mind because Kent hadn't spoken. "Just think yourself to a place and time and I will take you there." All sorts of possibilities floated through Kent's mind, glorious red-letter days from the past, as well as the darker days when things had gone horribly wrong. Maybe he could revisit those and settle some old scores. But where should he start? "I'll tell you what," suggested the angel. "To start off with, why don't you go back to that day you were thinking about earlier, the day you bought your first record? You seemed pretty happy when you were thinking about that." "Perfect," replied Kent. It would be fun to be a kid again. He could figure out the rest later. "When do we start?" "There's no time like the present," replied the angel. He clicked his fingers, and the rooftop, the sunset, and everything else dissolved into nothingness. Chapter 3. What difference does it make? February 1984. The first thought that went through Kent's head when he woke up was, "What a bloody weird dream that was." The second was, "Wow, I feel great." For as long as he could remember, Kent had felt like death warmed up in the mornings. His mouth was usually bone dry and crusted with a mixture of gooey and crusty white mucus, caused by lying on his back all night snoring with his mouth wide open. The half a dozen beers he knocked back before bed most nights might have given the illusion of lubrication, drinking them, but in reality they only contributed to the dehydrated state he found himself in by the morning. He couldn't have felt more parched if he'd been wandering lost in the Sahara Desert for 2 days. Most mornings he couldn't even speak until he'd had the life-saving cup of tea that Debs brought him, if she brought it. Whether he got one or not depended on what sort of mood she was in. Over time, her disposition towards him was becoming increasingly unfavourable, and the frequency of the tea was declining accordingly. He could normally tell whether he was going to get one or not by the state of his ribs. If he could feel any pain there, it meant he probably would not. She had been poking and kicking him in the side all night in a forlorn attempt to try and stop his snoring. At her insistence, he had tried all manner of remedies to stop and cure the problem, from various revolting herbal concoctions that Debs had insisted he drink before bed, to some stupid plasters that she had made him stick across his nose. None of them had made the slightest bit of difference. To make matters worse, the plasters had made him a laughing-stock one day when he'd forgotten to remove one before he went to work. She'd even bought some ridiculous contraption that enabled her to strap tennis balls to his back one night. It was bloody ridiculous and uncomfortable. He refused to wear it again, at which point she insisted that he went to see the doctor about it. Grudgingly, he'd made an appointment to see Dr. Dickinson at the local surgery. He had diagnosed sleep apnea and recommended that Kent lose some weight. This seemed to be standard advice dished out for pretty much every ailment Kent had suffered in the past 10 years, and he was sick of hearing it. High blood pressure, gout, and even a bloody ear infection had all been put down to his weight. He couldn't see how the latter worked. Ears didn't get fat, did they? They made the foolish mistake of telling Debs what the doctor had said. She responded immediately by trying to put him on a diet, serving up salads and trying to get him to eat less meat and more fish. He hated eating fish. It didn't agree with him, and it made his urine smell like scampi-flavour fries. None of it made any difference to his weight, as she couldn't control what he ate at work, so he regularly made up for shortfall in calories at lunchtime. Waking up now, in 1984, he felt as light as a feather, and better than he had in years. It was an unconventional way of going about it, but he'd indeed lost weight. About 14 stone, in fact. And that wasn't the only thing. His mouth was mucus-free, and his head was clear. As he sat up and opened his eyes, free of the crusty sleepy dust that normally welded them shut, he also discovered that he had razor-sharp 20/20 vision. His first thoughts about how great he was feeling were superseded as he took in the scene around him. He knew instantly where he was, even though he had not set foot in the room for over a quarter of a century. The first thing he saw was the wallpaper, which immediately revealed his location. Every wall in the room was clad in scenes from Return of the Jedi. It was the first film Kent had ever seen at the cinema in the summer of 1983, and he had pestered his dad for weeks afterwards for the wallpaper. Sent to stay at his grandparents for a couple of nights in August, he returned on his birthday to the delight of discovering his newly decorated room. He glanced to his left to see the Charlie Brown clock he had learnt to tell the time from. It was 8:30. Then he looked down at his body. The Star Wars theme extended to his pyjamas, but it was what was inside them that shocked him. The hairy fat belly, peeling dry legs, and gnarled old toenails were gone. The smooth skin that met his gaze confirmed he was truly back in his 7-year-old body. The angel had been true to his word. He was young again. This was really happening. He felt incredibly alive and full of energy, spontaneously leapt up and started bouncing up and down on the bed with joy. Had the 42-year-old 18-stone version of Kent done that, not only would he have broken the slats on the bed, he might possibly have gone through the floor as well. Even so, his youthful exuberance was enough to attract attention from downstairs. "Hey, how many times have I told you to stop bouncing up and down on that bed? It's not a trampoline, you know."